Daniel Harrington had everything most people could only dream of. Born into modest means, he had clawed his way to the top, building a multi-million-dollar empire in the tech industry. His company, Harrington Technologies, was at the forefront of innovation, a name synonymous with success and cutting-edge solutions. He was a man of vision and grit, the kind of person who inspired admiration in the hearts of many. But more than his business acumen, it was his philanthropy that truly set him apart. He donated millions to charitable causes, funded scholarships for underprivileged students, and supported medical research that saved lives. To the outside world, Daniel was a self-made man with a heart of gold. He had everything anyone could want: success, wealth, and the admiration of his peers. His wife, Laura, was the picture of grace and elegance. A former model, Laura had settled into the role of a philanthropist's wife with ease, often accompanying Daniel to events and charity galas, always by his side. Their marriage seemed perfect from the outside. They had a beautiful home in the city, a vacation house by the beach, and a lavish lifestyle that only the truly wealthy could afford. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far from perfect. While Daniel was busy managing his empire and growing his wealth, Laura had started to drift. She'd become distant, secretive, and cold. Daniel noticed the subtle changes in her behavior but, consumed by his work, he brushed it off as just another phase. He never questioned her loyalty, not in a million years. After all, they had been together for nearly a decade, a love story that had started in their youth and seemed unshakable. James Montgomery, Daniel's business partner, had been a fixture in his life for as long as he could remember. The two men had started Harrington Technologies together in their 20s, and their partnership had always been rock solid. James was the yin to Daniel's yang, where Daniel was a visionary, James was the strategist. They complemented each other perfectly. Over the years, James had become more than just a business partner, he was a close friend, someone Daniel trusted implicitly. They had shared countless late nights discussing the future of the company, celebrating victories, and weathering the occasional setback. Daniel never thought twice about bringing James into his inner circle. In fact, he trusted him with everything: his business, his family, his life. But the cracks in Daniel's world were starting to show, though he remained oblivious to them. Laura had become increasingly distant, often spending long hours away from him, and her affection seemed to be reserved for James. It started with little things, secretive glances, private conversations, whispers that Daniel never quite caught. The late-night meetings between James and Laura had become more frequent, and Daniel, wrapped up in the demands of his company, never thought to question them. He chalked it up to the closeness of their friendship. It was only after an incident during a weekend getaway that Daniel began to feel the first real stirrings of doubt. They were at their beach house, a place they usually visited to unwind and reconnect. But on this particular trip, something was off. Laura had barely spoken to him the entire weekend, and when she did, her words were curt and distant. James had been acting strangely too, often stepping away for long stretches, disappearing without explanation. Daniel tried to ignore it, but the unease gnawed at him. That night, as he lay awake in their bedroom, he overheard a hushed conversation from the hallway. Laura's voice was low, but he could hear her clearly. She was speaking to James. "You know what you have to do," Laura whispered. "This has to be done soon. I can't wait much longer." James's voice was equally quiet but laced with urgency. "I know. We'll get everything ready. He's trusting me more than ever. He won't see it coming." Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he realized what he was hearing. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that he was being paranoid. But the words kept echoing in his mind, and the feeling of dread grew stronger. What had he missed? What was really going on between Laura and James? The next morning, he confronted them both. Laura's reaction was defensive, and James seemed unusually nervous. They both assured him that everything was fine, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the conversation he overheard that night was the first sign of the betrayal that would soon shatter his world. Weeks passed, and Daniel tried to focus on his work, but the unease lingered. He threw himself into the company, hoping that if he kept busy enough, the strange feeling in his gut would subside. But it didn't. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Daniel returned home to an empty house. Laura was out, as usual, and James was nowhere to be found. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so he decided to follow his instincts. He opened the drawer in his office desk and took out the sleeper agent that had been entrusted to him long ago, a device designed to record conversations in the house. He'd had it installed just in case of an emergency, but he'd never imagined he'd need it. Now, it felt like a necessary precaution. For the next few days, Daniel monitored the recordings. What he heard was nothing short of chilling. The conversations between Laura and James had taken a darker turn. They were no longer just talking about business or charity events. They were discussing his death, in precise detail. They had been planning it for months. The heart attack he had suffered earlier was not natural. It had been induced. The entire thing was a carefully orchestrated scheme to get rid of him and claim his fortune. Laura and James weren't just lovers, they were co-conspirators, working together to take everything he had built. The shock of hearing their voices, cold and calculating, sent Daniel's mind reeling. He couldn't believe it, his wife, the woman he had loved for years, had been plotting his murder. And his closest friend, James, had been in on it the whole time. The trust he had placed in them, the loyalty he had shown, had all been a lie. He felt sick to his stomach, betrayed by the two people he had trusted most in the world. It was a betrayal of the highest order, one that would cost him everything. In a daze, Daniel began to make plans. He couldn't confront them directly, not yet. He knew they would try to cover their tracks, to make sure he never found out. But he couldn't let it go. He needed to get proof, to expose them for what they truly were. He had no idea how, but he knew he had to act fast. The days blurred together as Daniel plotted his next move, each moment filled with a sense of urgency. His entire life had been a lie, and now he had to take control of the situation before it was too late. It was on the morning of his big charity gala that everything changed. Daniel had made arrangements to leave the country, to disappear for good. But just as he was about to execute his plan, his heart gave out. Or so they thought. What they didn't know was that his heart attack had been the beginning of a journey that would lead to the most shocking revelation of all. Little did they know that their carefully laid plans were about to unravel in the most unexpected way. Daniel was not gone. He had been declared dead, but in reality, he was only just getting started. As the gala came to a close that night, the final piece of his plan fell into place. His body was whisked away for burial, but Daniel wasn't going to lie down and accept it. Not when he had a chance to expose the truth. Little did his wife and business partner know, they were about to face the wrath of a man who had been given a second chance at life. Daniel was about to wake up, and what he would hear would leave him speechless. The world outside moved on, blissfully unaware of the dark undercurrent that was steadily pulling at the very fabric of Daniel's life. The days following his supposed death were marked by a sickening sense of calm. Laura had taken charge of the funeral arrangements with an icy efficiency that seemed far too practiced. The house was filled with mourners, friends, and business associates who came to pay their respects, but Daniel felt nothing but the cold emptiness of betrayal. He was trapped inside his own mind, his body lying in the coffin, his breath absent from the world, but his thoughts racing with fury. It had all happened so fast. One minute he was alive, a successful businessman at the peak of his career, and the next he was in a grave, a victim of a plot he never saw coming. The funeral, a lavish affair as expected, was not an event of grief for those who attended but rather an opportunity for the conspirators to solidify their victory. As they gathered in the church, Daniel heard the quiet whispers of admiration for Laura. They spoke of her strength, her poise in the face of tragedy, and how well she had handled herself through the difficult circumstances. James, too, was the subject of murmurs. His role as Daniel's best friend and business partner had earned him sympathetic nods, and many people were quick to offer their condolences. They had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. From his vantage point in the darkened space of his mind, Daniel could hear everything. Every whispered comment, every hushed conversation. He was trapped in a world between life and death, unable to speak or move but fully aware of the betrayal that surrounded him. The voices, however, were the worst part. The ones he had trusted most in life, his wife and his closest business partner, were now nothing but the architects of his downfall. They didn't know that he could still hear them. They didn't know that their words were about to seal their fates. Laura and James had been speaking candidly just moments before the funeral service began. Daniel could hear their voices clearly, as if they were right beside him. His heart, if it could still beat, would have shattered into 1,000 pieces. The betrayal was far worse than he could have imagined. "You did it, Laura," James said, his voice thick with something Daniel couldn't quite place. Relief? Satisfaction? It didn't matter. It's done. He's gone. Everything is ours now. Laura's laugh, hollow and cold, echoed through Daniel's mind. "I can't believe it worked. He never suspected a thing. All that money, the company, it's ours. You'll take over his role at Harrington Technologies, won't you, James?" James hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice tinged with a certain unease. "Of course. You know I've been handling things with him for years. But, something still feels off. It's too easy. He was smart, too smart. We should have been more careful." Laura brushed off his concerns. "Stop worrying. It's too late now. And besides, we've waited too long for this. Everything is falling into place. We'll be on top, just like we always dreamed." Daniel wanted to scream. He wanted to break free from his prison of silence and rage against them both. But there was nothing he could do, nothing but listen as the woman he loved and the man he called his best friend spoke so casually about the life they had stolen from him. As the funeral service began, Daniel felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. He had always been a man of action, someone who had controlled every aspect of his life with meticulous care. Now, it seemed as though every move had been part of a sickening game, a game that had been rigged from the very beginning. But he was not one to sit idly by. He had been given a second chance, a gift, though not one that came without its own set of challenges. The minutes dragged on, but Daniel was not merely a passive observer. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He had no body to move, no voice to speak, but he had his mind, and that was his greatest weapon. He had to find a way to make them realize their mistake, to show them that they had failed to kill him. He needed to prove that he was still alive, that he was still in control. But how? He couldn't wait around for someone to discover the truth. He couldn't just hope that someone would come to his rescue. The world had moved on without him, and the only person who could change his fate was him. But what could he do when he had no power over his own body? What could he do when his fate had been sealed by the very people he trusted most? As the funeral continued, Daniel's mind worked furiously, devising a plan. He had to make it clear to Laura and James that he was still in the game. He had to make them doubt their success, to show them that their victory had been premature. But how? His mind was sharp, but the constraints of his physical situation were limiting. He had to rely on the smallest of details, the slightest crack in their carefully constructed facade. Suddenly, an idea struck him. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one he had. He would make them feel the fear he had felt when he had first overheard their conversation. He would make them believe that they were not as untouchable as they thought. But how would he communicate with the world? How could he expose them for the frauds they were when he had no voice, no body? That's when it hit him. The funeral arrangements, the crowd of mourners, the speeches, the eulogies, it was all a performance, a spectacle for the public. But behind the scenes, it was just Laura and James, two conspirators who had no idea that their game was far from over. Daniel would use the very thing they thought was his downfall, their belief in his death, as his weapon. He focused his thoughts, concentrating on the simplest of actions. If he could just make a sound, anything to disrupt the proceedings, to show them that he was still here, he could begin to turn the tables. But how? He focused on the smallest of movements in his mind, willing his body to respond, to show that he was not as lifeless as they believed. Suddenly, a faint sound, a faint crack, was heard from the coffin. The crowd paused, unsure of what had just happened. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air was thick with tension. No one moved, no one spoke, but all eyes were on the casket. And then, as if by divine intervention, a single movement, a twitch, caused the coffin to shift ever so slightly. It was subtle, but it was enough to send a ripple of fear through the room. Laura froze. James's face paled as he turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. What was that?" he whispered. The sound was faint, but it was enough. In that moment, Daniel had created the first crack in their armor. He had made them doubt themselves, doubt their victory. They had no idea what was happening, but they could feel it. Something had gone wrong. Something was not as it seemed. The murmurs spread quickly through the room. The priest, who had been leading the ceremony, looked at the casket with a furrowed brow, unsure of what to make of the strange occurrence. The mourners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the unease palpable in the air. No one knew what to think, but everyone knew something had changed. And then, the coffin moved again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It shifted, just slightly, as if responding to the tension in the air. The sound was unmistakable. The truth, whatever it was about to come to light. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath. The coffin, once a symbol of finality, was now a source of confusion, fear, and growing curiosity. Every eye in the room was fixed on the object of their attention, but no one dared approach it. The faint shift had been enough to send a shiver down the spines of those present. It was as if the laws of nature had been bent, or worse, shattered. Daniel's mind raced. What had happened? He had no idea if he had caused it consciously or if it was some random movement of his body. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had created a crack in their carefully constructed world. Laura, the woman who had betrayed him, and James, the man he had trusted as his closest ally, were now questioning their own actions. Doubt had been planted, and it was growing by the second. The funeral service, which had been nothing more than a formality to those in attendance, now became a spectacle. The priest fumbled over his words, uncertain of how to proceed, and the mourners murmured among themselves. Was it the wind? A trick of the acoustics? Or was it something else entirely? No one knew for sure, but everyone felt it. Something had changed. Laura, always composed, stood frozen in the center of the room, her eyes glued to the coffin. Her lips trembled, and her hand went instinctively to her neck, a nervous gesture that only Daniel could see. She had never expected anything like this. She had thought the worst was over, that she had won, that the life she wanted was within her grasp. But now, as the coffin seemed to shift again, she began to question her own sanity. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, and for the first time since the plan had begun, she felt a flicker of fear. James, too, was on edge. He had been the one to suggest the plan, the one to convince Laura that Daniel's death was the only way forward. He had been so sure that it would all go smoothly. After all, Daniel had been nothing more than a pawn to him, an obstacle to their mutual success. But now, with each passing second, James felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. What if this wasn't over? What if Daniel was still alive? The mourners, sensing the unease that had gripped the room, began to exchange nervous glances. The whispers started, quiet at first, but growing in volume. Was that a noise? Did you hear that? One asked. Another replied, it's nothing. It must have been the wind or the old wood creaking. But their words rang hollow. No one believed it. Something was wrong. Laura's fingers twitched, and she took a hesitant step toward the coffin. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she reached for the lid, unsure whether to open it or simply leave it alone. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, she hesitated, her mind flooded with 1,000 doubts. The thoughts swirled around her head like a storm. Was Daniel really gone? Could this all be a mistake? Had they made a terrible, irreversible error? It was then that the sound came again. This time, it was louder, a deliberate knock, a tap from within the coffin. The mourners gasped, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Laura recoiled as though she had been struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. James stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of color. The priest stumbled backward, his holy book slipping from his hands as he took in the sight before him. Impossible, Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. This can't be happening. The knock was unmistakable. Another, this time more forceful. It reverberated through the air like a warning. A message. A sign. The reality of the situation began to dawn on everyone in the room. Daniel, the man they had believed to be dead, was still alive. But how? And why? The questions swirled in their minds, but the answers were just out of reach. Daniel's body, or at least what remained of it, was still encased in the coffin. His mind, however, was alive, alert, and filled with a burning desire for revenge. He could feel every movement of his limbs, every small twitch of his fingers, every subtle shift of his body. He was trapped in a tomb of his own creation, but he could still think, still plan, still fight. He was not a passive observer of his fate, he was the one in control. The room was now in complete chaos. Some of the mourners were scrambling to the exits, too afraid to be anywhere near the coffin. Others stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the scene unfolding before them. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of dread and curiosity. What would happen next? Would the coffin open? Would Daniel rise from the dead? Laura took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She looked around at the faces in the room, each one filled with fear and confusion. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it was happening, and she had no control over it. James, too, was visibly shaken. He had seen everything, his betrayal, his carefully laid out plans, his shared moment of triumph with Laura. But now, as the reality of the situation settled in, he wondered if it had all been for nothing. What if Daniel had somehow survived? What if he had somehow managed to escape the fate they had so carefully prepared for him? The room was filled with voices now, the confusion and panic escalating with each passing moment. But amidst the chaos, a single voice broke through. "We have to open it," someone called out. It was a voice full of urgency, of desperation. The priest nodded, his hands trembling as he motioned toward the coffin. "Get help," the priest said, his voice strained. "Call an ambulance, someone. We need to open it." But Laura, her hands shaking with fear, stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't. We have to leave him in peace." James grabbed her arm. "Are you insane? He could be alive. He could be." Laura wrenched her arm free, her face pale. "He's not alive, James." He can't be. He just can't be. But the knock came again, louder this time, rattling the coffin and causing the room to erupt in panic. The mourners screamed, some even running out of the church in sheer terror. Others stood frozen, too scared to move, too afraid of what might happen next. And then, against all odds, the coffin lid began to creak open. It moved slowly at first, as if reluctant to reveal its contents. The sound of the lid scraping against the wood filled the room, a sound that seemed to stretch on forever. But it was enough to confirm what everyone feared, and what Daniel had hoped for. The coffin opened fully, and there he was. Daniel. Alive. His eyes snapped open, and for the first time since his death, he breathed in deeply, taking in the air around him. His body ached, stiff from the ordeal, but his mind was alive and burning with fury. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The people who had betrayed him would now face the consequences. Daniel struggled to sit up, his hands pushing against the lid of the coffin as he forced himself to his feet. The room was silent, the realization of what was happening sinking in slowly. This was no dream. This was no illusion. Daniel was alive, and his return was about to shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew. Laura stumbled back, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. You're alive? But how? Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes wide with shock. James, too, stood motionless, staring at his former friend as if he had just seen a ghost. I'm not just alive, Laura, Daniel said, his voice cold and filled with venom. I'm back. And you'll both pay for what you've done. The room was still, and the air hung heavy with disbelief. Every eye was fixed on Daniel as he slowly rose from the coffin. His movements were deliberate, calculated, and there was no mistaking the fire that burned in his eyes. This was no longer the weak, betrayed man they had thought they had silenced. This was something else, something darker, something that had survived the impossible. The silence was broken only by the sharp sound of his boots against the floor as he took slow, purposeful steps toward the shocked crowd. Laura stood frozen, her breath shallow, her chest tight with panic. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had been so sure that they had won, that Daniel was gone for good. She had believed in her own lies, in the carefully constructed facade they had built. But now, it was all crumbling before her eyes. The guilt, the fear, it all surged within her as she struggled to process what was happening. What had she done? What had they done? She had crossed a line, and now, there was no turning back. The betrayal she had so willingly enacted was staring her in the face, and it was about to consume her. James, too, stood motionless, unable to comprehend what was happening. His mind raced as he tried to come up with an explanation, something that would make sense of the impossible. But there was no answer, no rational explanation that could undo what had been done. He had wanted power, money, and control, and he had used Laura and Daniel as pawns to get it. But now, as he looked at Daniel, the man he had betrayed, the full weight of his actions settled on him. He had played a dangerous game, and he had lost. Daniel's voice, low and steady, cut through the silence like a blade. You thought I was gone. You thought you had won. But you were wrong. His gaze moved from Laura to James, each word dripping with a venomous calm that sent a chill down their spines. I may have been buried, but I was never truly dead. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your greed. Laura took a shaky step back, her eyes wide with fear. No, you're not real. This can't be happening. She stammered, her voice cracking. You're supposed to be dead. We made sure you were dead. Daniel's lips curled into a bitter smile, his anger palpable in every word. Did you really think you could bury me and walk away without paying the price? No, Laura. No one gets away with this. Not you, not James, not anyone. His words hung in the air, a promise of retribution that was impossible to ignore. Daniel had been through hell to get here, and now that he had been given a second chance, he wasn't going to waste it. He would expose the lies, the manipulation, the corruption, and he would make sure that those responsible would never forget the cost of their actions. The priest, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally found his voice. We need to call the police," he said, his voice trembling. This is madness. You're not supposed to be here." But his words barely registered. Daniel was past the point of caring about the law. What he had to do now was much bigger than the law. Laura's panic increased as she realized that there was no escape. She had thought that this day would be the end of everything, that once Daniel was gone, she and James could build the life they had dreamed of. But now, her world was collapsing around her. The guilt was suffocating, and the fear of what Daniel might do next was consuming her. James stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "You don't know what you're talking about, Daniel," he said, his voice steady but betraying the unease that was bubbling just beneath the surface. "We did what we had to do. It was just business. You were a liability, nothing more. This was the only way forward." Daniel's eyes flashed with fury, and in that moment, James knew he had made a grave mistake. His words were no longer convincing. The betrayal was too deep, the consequences too severe. There was no explanation, no justification that could make what they had done right. And now, Daniel was here, and nothing could undo the damage they had caused. "You think this was business?" Daniel's voice was low, but it carried an intensity that sent a ripple of fear through James. "You took my life for your own gain, James. You thought you could walk away without paying the price. But the price is coming. And it will be worse than anything you've ever imagined." Laura's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the ground, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had always thought she could handle the consequences of her actions, but now, as the reality of the situation hit her, she realized she had no control. The weight of her guilt was too much to bear, and she felt the crushing realization that her life, her future, had been built on a lie. James, on the other hand, stood with a mixture of defiance and fear. He had been in control for so long, used to getting what he wanted by manipulating people, by bending them to his will. But Daniel was different. Daniel had not been an easy target. And now, with everything falling apart around him, James realized that he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the man he had betrayed. Daniel took a step toward him, his gaze never leaving James's face. "You thought I was weak," he said quietly. "You thought I was just a man you could easily push aside. But you were wrong. I'm stronger than you can ever imagine. And now, I'm going to make sure you understand just how strong." The room seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The mourners, who had been watching in silence, exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had begun to move toward the door, but no one dared leave. It felt like a trap, an inescapable web closing around them. Daniel had returned, and there was no going back. "You can't do this," James said, his voice shaking now. You're dead. You can't just come back in." "I'm not dead, James," Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. "I was never dead. I was just waiting." He took another step forward. "Waiting for you to think you had won. Waiting for the moment when you'd think I couldn't fight back. But now, you're going to pay. And you'll never forget it." The silence in the room was deafening. Laura's sobs filled the space, but no one moved. No one spoke. Daniel's words had struck deep, and now everyone was frozen in place, unsure of what was going to happen next. Daniel turned away from James and Laura, his focus shifting to the crowd of mourners who had gathered to watch this grotesque spectacle unfold. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the fear, the confusion, and the realization that everything had changed. He paused, his voice steady but filled with a deep, bone-chilling resolve. "Let this be a warning," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "No one gets to play with my life. No one gets to use me for their own gain. And no one gets to walk away without facing the consequences." As the words hung in the air, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready. He had been given a second chance, and he would make sure that his enemies, his betrayers, would never forget the price of crossing him. And as the room remained silent, the weight of Daniel's words settled in. They knew that the consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. And they would all have to live with the truth of what had been done. The world they had once known had changed forever. Daniel's return had ignited a firestorm, and the world that had once been so familiar now felt alien to him. What had once been his life, a life of luxury, power, and unchecked success, had crumbled into a twisted version of itself. Everything he had worked for, every ambition, every dream, had been shattered in the wake of his untimely death and subsequent resurrection. But the worst part, the part that haunted him every waking moment, was the betrayal, the cold, calculated betrayal by the woman he had loved and the man who had once called him a friend. As Daniel stood before them, his voice still echoing in the tense silence of the room, he realized that nothing could undo what had been done. He could not turn back the clock. He could not erase the scars left on his heart or on his soul. But there was one thing he could do: he could make them pay. James and Laura had been sitting together in a silent, stunned stupor, their eyes locked on Daniel, unable to comprehend what had just happened. For so long, they had been able to manipulate the world around them, twisting everything to fit their own needs, bending others to their will. They had thought Daniel's death was the end of the story. They had believed that with him out of the picture, nothing could stand in the way of their success. But now, as Daniel stood before them, they were beginning to understand the cost of their actions, the toll that betrayal had taken on them, and the consequences they would have to face. Laura's sobs had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. She was no longer crying. Instead, she sat with her head in her hands, shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't fear that gripped her anymore, but guilt. The weight of what she had done was unbearable. She had chosen James over Daniel, chosen power and control over love and loyalty, and now, there was no escape from the consequences of that decision. James, meanwhile, was still trying to piece together what was happening. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way out, anything that could restore the order he had once known. But there was no answer. There was no magic word that could undo the devastation. There was no silver bullet that could make Daniel go away. And the realization was suffocating. James was a man who had always been in control, always been the one pulling the strings. But now, the strings had slipped through his fingers, and the control he had worked so hard for had slipped away like sand through a clenched fist. Daniel's eyes locked onto James's, and for the first time in his life, James felt small. He had always been the one who stood tall, the one who wielded power over others. But now, facing Daniel's gaze, he could feel the weight of the years of manipulation, the years of lies, bearing down on him. The shame was unbearable. "Do you understand now, James?" Daniel's voice was steady, calm, but there was a cutting edge to it that sent a shiver down James's spine. "Do you understand what it feels like to have everything you know and love ripped away from you? To be thrown aside like you're nothing more than a disposable pawn? I've been where you are, and I've seen the truth. You're not in control anymore. You never were. You've always been nothing but a puppet, and now you'll see just how deep the strings go." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense. There was no way to explain away the things he had done, the betrayals he had orchestrated. There was no way to justify his actions. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be powerless. He had used Daniel, taken everything from him, and now, there was no escape from the consequences of those choices. Laura's voice broke the silence. "Please, Daniel, don't do this. Please. We never meant for it to go this far. We never wanted any of this. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid of losing everything. And James, he promised that if we got rid of you, we would be free. We'd be together, we'd have everything we wanted, but I see now how wrong I was. Please, don't destroy us." Daniel's gaze softened for just a moment. He could see the desperation in Laura's eyes, the raw emotion that had been buried beneath her cold exterior. But he knew better than to show sympathy now. He had been through hell and back. He had been left to die, betrayed by the very people who should have protected him. And now, those same people were begging for mercy. They had destroyed him, and now they wanted forgiveness. But Daniel had learned something in the darkness, something that could never be unlearned. There was no redemption for betrayal. There was no path back to the man he had once been. And the truth was, they didn't deserve his mercy. Not after everything they had done. "No, Laura," Daniel said, his voice low and filled with finality. "You don't get to beg for mercy now. You don't get to pretend like you're the victim here. You made your choice. You made your bed, and now you'll lie in it. You've taken everything from me, and now it's my turn to take everything from you." His words were like a punch to the gut, and Laura recoiled as though physically struck. She had never truly understood the depth of her betrayal until now. It was one thing to manipulate someone from the shadows, to pull the strings while remaining in control. But it was another thing entirely to face the person you had wronged, to see the pain and fury in their eyes, and to know that you could never take back what you had done. James's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was no way out. The room felt like a trap, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. Every decision he had made had led him here, to this moment. There was no escaping the consequences. "I did what I had to do," James said, his voice shaking now. "I never wanted this. I never wanted you to die. But it was the only way. I thought I could get away with it. I thought I could have everything I wanted. But now," his voice trailed off, the weight of the situation suffocating him. Daniel smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You never understood what you were doing, did you, James? You thought this was about money, about power, about control. But it wasn't. It was about something deeper. It was about trust. And you broke that trust. You destroyed everything that mattered. And now, you're going to pay." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The air was thick with tension, and every eye in the room was on Daniel. It was clear now that nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel had returned not for revenge alone, but for justice. For the righting of wrongs. And those who had wronged him would have to live with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. As the seconds ticked by, Daniel felt the weight of the decision he was about to make settle on him. This was more than just an act of vengeance. This was the final chapter in a story of betrayal, of pain, and of redemption. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He would make sure that everyone knew what had happened, that everyone saw the price of betrayal. And when it was over, when the dust had settled, he would be free. Free from the past. Free from the lies. And he would finally have the peace he had been searching for all along. But for now, he had a final message to deliver. "I'm not finished yet," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "This is just the beginning." Daniel's words echoed through the room like a haunting refrain, reverberating in the minds of everyone present. They hung in the air, thick with the promise of an uncertain future, and for the first time since his return, he felt a surge of control, the power of not just being alive, but being alive with purpose. A fire burned within him, fueled by the injustices he had suffered, and it was a fire that would consume anyone who stood in his way. But as the room settled into a silence more profound than any words could create, Daniel realized something vital. This wasn't just about vengeance, not anymore. It was about redemption, yes, but more than that, it was about setting the scales right. What had been taken from him wasn't something that could be returned. The past could not be undone. The time that had slipped away from his life, the betrayal, the lies, all of that would forever be a part of his story, but now, it was time to move forward, to make the world pay for the choices it had made, for the lives it had ruined. James and Laura had remained still, trapped in their own web of guilt, shame, and disbelief. Their lives, once dominated by power and control, now seemed fragile and insignificant. Daniel saw them not as the dangerous adversaries they once were, but as broken souls who had painted themselves into a corner. But the irony didn't escape him. These were the same people who thought they could take everything from him. These were the same people who had orchestrated his downfall, convinced that their actions would remain in the shadows, unnoticed. But here they were, caught in the glaring light of his return, unable to escape. Laura's face was pale, her tears had dried, leaving her face streaked with a raw vulnerability that Daniel could never have imagined before. The walls of her arrogance had crumbled, and for the first time, she was no longer the confident woman who had betrayed him, but just a woman who had made a horrible mistake, perhaps the biggest mistake of her life. She had placed her trust in the wrong person, and now, it was clear she was paying the price. Her voice cracked as she spoke, a mere whisper in the thick, suffocating silence. I thought I was doing what was best. I thought I was protecting us, protecting me. But I see now that I was wrong. So wrong. Daniel, please, if there's any mercy left in you, if there's any part of you that can remember who we were, what we had, please. I'm sorry. Her words, filled with regret, fell on deaf ears. Daniel had heard these apologies 1,000 times before, each one too late, each one hollow. He had been the fool, the one left behind while they moved on, as if he were nothing more than an obstacle. But now, Daniel wasn't the one standing at the edge of that abyss. Now, they were. James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Daniel and Laura, as if seeking a way out, a way to undo what had already been set in motion. But he knew as well as Daniel did that there was no going back. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, his decisions, his actions, they had led them here, and no amount of pleading or false remorse would change that fact. I didn't want this, Daniel, James finally muttered, his voice low and strained. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be with Laura. I thought I could keep everything under control. But it all spiraled. And now, it's too late, isn't it? Daniel's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer to James. Control, he repeated bitterly. You think you ever had control? You were always just a pawn in your own game. Laura was never yours to keep. You never understood that. You took a life, my life, and thought you could just walk away without consequence. James opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He realized, too late, the extent of the harm he had caused. There was no justification for his actions. There was no excuse for taking someone's life, for destroying everything that had once meant something. And now, all that was left was the bitter taste of regret, and it was choking him. Daniel let the silence hang in the air for what felt like an eternity. This was the moment of reckoning, the point where everything would change. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew he had one final decision to make. This wasn't just about punishment. It wasn't about exacting revenge, no matter how justified it felt. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be now that he was back. He had been given a second chance at life, but what would he do with it? Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything he had endured. I'm done with the past. But you too, he let the words linger, heavy in the air. You've got a long road ahead of you. And you will pay for what you've done. Not because I want revenge, but because life has a way of balancing the scales. And sooner or later, the truth always comes to light. He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway, his back to them. Remember this, both of you. You thought you could bury me. You thought you could erase me from the world. But you were wrong. I'm not going anywhere. You'll see that, soon enough. As Daniel stepped out of the room and into the cool night air, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. The ghosts of the past had not disappeared, but they had been put in their place. He had confronted the betrayal, the lies, and now, it was time to move forward. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more decisions to be made, more battles to fight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt in control. And as he walked away from the wreckage of the life he had once known, he realized something profound. Life didn't just give second chances. It demanded them. But in those second chances, there was power, the power to shape your destiny, to redefine who you were, and to rise above the darkness that had once consumed you. Daniel's journey had been filled with pain, with loss, and with betrayal, but it was also a journey of redemption. And in the end, he would decide what kind of man he would be, no longer a victim, no longer someone defined by his past, but someone who could face the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. As he disappeared into the night, one thought lingered in his mind: the past might have shaped him, but it was the choices he made in the present that would define his future. And whatever that future held, Daniel was ready to face it. With resolve, he took a deep breath and moved forward, leaving behind the broken pieces of his old life and stepping into the unknown.